The Nebula Awards are voted on by writers, the people who shape science fiction and fantasy itself. I read every Nebula Award-winning book for Best Novel from the 2000s. The question is, do they live up to past Nebulas, or has the award lost its edge? Are any of these books worth reading? Starting with 2000, Darwin's Radio by Greg Bear. A CDC biologist and a paleontologist find themselves at the center of a global crisis where an ancient retrovirus buried within human DNA suddenly activates, which causes pregnant women around the world to miscarry. The book feels like it's split into two parts. The first follows the main characters as they investigate the mystery behind the virus, and while they're doing this, the government struggles to contain the panic caused by the worldwide miscarriage pandemic. The second part of the story kind of focuses on the discovery of what the virus is actually doing and explores the possibility that it represents the next stage of human evolution. It has a lot of emphasis on viruses, genetics, and biology. It was written more than 25 years ago, so I'm not sure how all of that still holds up, because I'm sure the fields have developed since the book was first put out. The book basically poses a question of what if evolution works in other ways. So most people have been taught that evolution happens over a long period of time, but is it possible that under certain conditions, could dramatic evolution happen in just a generation or two? And by the end of the book, you realize what's happening as mutants are being born with these special abilities. And I think that's kind of the problem, is there's already so much fiction exploring this idea. What would happen if people are born with special abilities and the government started persecuting them? And if I wanted that plot line, I could just read any kind of X-Men comic or revisit an older sci-fi classic like Slan. The book also has pretty mediocre character development, and it doesn't have a very good conclusion since it's set up in a way for a sequel to follow, but I had no desire to read a sequel. I think the strongest part of the book is the beginning and how the government initially reacts to the pandemic, but overall it's a rather skippable book. That said, I've heard a lot of good things about Blood Music, so I may have to give that one a try at some point. 2001, The Quantum Rose by Catherine Acero. The book can be read as a standalone, but it is part of the Saga of the Skolian Empire series. The basic plot follows a young ruler on a backwater planet who is pressured into an arranged marriage with a mysterious prince. She soon discovers that he is connected to interstellar politics far larger than her small world. The story is part Beauty and the Beast retelling with a sci-fi backdrop, and part allegory built around quantum scattering theory. In very simple terms, quantum scattering theory explores how particles behave when they interact with something else. The novel uses this idea as a framework to explore how interactions can transform people and alter the path their lives take. This setup is most likely why the book won the Nebula Award, because if you look at the story purely on its own, I don't think it's really a book that would win. It felt like a type of romance novel that some readers might enjoy as a guilty pleasure. It's basically a melodramatic space opera romance. Whether it holds up as an example of that genre, I'm not really sure since it's not something I typically read. However, as a Nebula Award-winning novel, I found it rather lackluster compared to everything I've read so far. 2002, American Gods by Neil Gaiman. So this book, Paladin of Souls, the Yiddish Policeman's Union, and Windup Girl won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards. I'm going to keep the reviews for these books a bit shorter since I covered them in my Hugo series. The story follows Shadow, an ex-convict who takes a job as the bodyguard for a mysterious man named Mr. Wednesday. Together they travel across the US, meeting strange individuals and witnessing increasingly bizarre supernatural events. Before long, Shadow finds himself caught in a hidden war between the old gods and the new gods. Old gods are mythological deities brought to America by immigrants, while the new gods embody modern obsessions. And a god's power is determined by the number of people who believe in them and worship them. The more followers they have, the stronger they become. The fewer they have, the weaker they grow. So this creates a conflict between the fading European gods of old tradition and the new gods who embody modern forces such as media and technology. The story blends a road trip adventure with mythological allegory, ultimately serving as a meditation on faith, cultural identity, and the changing values of American society. I appreciated the novel's scope and ambition, in particular how it explores America's cultural evolution, the decline of traditional religions as they were replaced by more modern influences and obsessions. My biggest criticism is that for a book titled American Gods that explores the spiritual landscape of America so extensively, it leaves out Jesus Christ, which is a pretty big omission considering we were talking about America. And Gaiman does explain this omission, but it kind of felt like a cop-out to me. Overall, though, it is a book I would recommend. 2003, The Speed of Dark by Elizabeth Moon is set in a near future where our main protagonist Lou is an autistic man with a stable job and a quiet, contented life. He's pressured by his employer to undergo an experimental quote-unquote cure, and that is the extent of the sci-fi in the book. There's a way to treat autism, and the book explores what exactly that means. Does autism need to be cured if the people living with it don't want a cure? Could you even consider it a cure? It's a quiet interior character study about identity and whether being fixed is the same as being helped. I think the book is fine. It just kind of feels like a slightly weaker and longer version of Flowers for Algernon, which was written 40 plus years before this. 2004, Paladin of Souls by Louis McMaster Bujold. This is a medieval-inspired fantasy novel featuring castles, swords, and sorcery. It's the second book in the world of the Five Gods series. The story follows Ista, a middle-aged heroine who embarks on a religious pilgrimage to escape the quiet, constrained life of royalty. The journey proves far more adventurous than expected as she becomes entangled in a dangerous supernatural plot involving gods, demons, curses, and the court politics of a neighboring kingdom. Ista's journey is one of self-discovery, and her colorful past, full of experiences and trauma, makes her feel multidimensional. The various gods, curses, and magical elements are well developed, though the story can be a bit confusing at first. It kind of just takes a while to understand what's truly happening. The writing style was far more mature than I expected, and featuring an older female protagonist breaks many traditional fantasy tropes and expectations. I don't think I'll continue reading the rest of the series, but overall I thought it was a solid novel. I've read a fair amount of McMaster at this point, and I just prefer her science fiction more than her fantasy. 2005, Camouflage by Joe Halderman. The book follows two semi-immortal shapeshifters who spend their lives living among humans in disguise. Even though they have similar abilities, they come from very different backgrounds, and as the years go by, they each take something different away from humanity. One of the shapeshifters learns about empathy and love, while the other becomes increasingly violent and turns into what is basically a psychopath killer. As the story progresses, it's evident that these two creatures are destined to face each other. The book is a rather short read. It's a decent adventure story with a badly written love side plot included in at the end. It's not a book I would recommend. I think Halderman's other works are way better, and I can't believe how this book somehow beat out Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell for the Nebula Award. I think that's kind of crazy. 2006, Seeker by Jack McDevitt. This is the third book in the Alex Benedict series, but this book can be read as a standalone. Alex, an antique dealer, and his pilot Chase investigate an artifact connected to a colony ship. This ship vanished thousands of years earlier, and the story turns into an archaeological detective story played out across the galaxy. Alex is usually the protagonist in most of the other books, but in this case, Chase is clearly the one you spend most of the time with. It's a well-crafted, plot-driven sci-fi mystery set in a future where space travel is commonplace, and our main characters are trying to find a lost colony. The novel does feature some advanced AI and some other technology. I thought it was a pretty solid, fun book. It felt like McDevitt knew exactly what kind of story he wanted to tell, and executed it well within his strengths. I will say that I was a bit surprised it won the Nebula Award. It never really had that wow factor. This book just felt like a solid sci-fi adventure. 2007, The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon. It's set in an alternative history where Jewish refugees were resettled in Alaska after the collapse of Israel in 1948. The novel imagines a temporary Jewish homeland that is now on the verge of being dissolved. With reversion approaching, political tension hangs over the community as the Jewish people don't know if they're going to be kicked out of another place they call home. The story follows Landsman, a down-and-out homicide detective who investigates the murder of a troubled chess prodigy living in his apartment building. What begins as a routine case soon uncovers powerful religious movements and political conspiracies tied to the future of the Jewish people. At its core, it's a classic hard-boiled detective story. Landsman is an alcoholic, he is divorced, and he knows how to bend the rules in order to get the truth. Where the novel really stands out is its atmosphere. It's steeped in Yiddish language, Jewish culture, and a lot of chess. The ending is the strongest part in my opinion, as it tackles themes of assimilation, religious extremism, and identity. Overall, it's a unique blend of alternative history and noir. I enjoyed it. It definitely falls into the category of just general speculative fiction, rather than anything specifically sci-fi or fantasy. 2008, Powers by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is the third book in the Annals of the Western Shore trilogy. Each book can be read as a standalone. The book is set in a loosely medieval society with no advanced technology, where power is mainly held by independent cities, merchants, and aristocratic families. In this world, some people are born with special abilities, and these powers play a much larger role in the first two books of the trilogy and are less important here. The story follows Gavir, an enslaved boy with the rare ability to see fragments of the future, and while this gift is part of the story, it isn't, I would say, essential to the story. The book itself has a fairly simple linear plot. It is really trying to focus on Gavir as a character and build up his character and his worldview. Having been a slave his entire life, Gavir initially sees nothing wrong with being owned by others. He doesn't dream of escape or really even consider the possibility of freedom. However, events in Gavir's life force him to begin exploring what freedom truly means, and the novel shows him struggling to gain freedom both physically and mentally. Although this is a fantasy novel, I think Le Guin does an excellent job portraying the realistic realities of slavery. Slavery has been a widespread institution through much of history, and it's still going on today in some parts of the world. Many enslaved people do not necessarily view freedom in the same way we do today, especially if they were raised to believe their masters have a rightful claim over them. I don't think you can go wrong with really reading any book by Le Guin, so I would recommend it. It's not the first book I would recommend by her, but it's still pretty solid. 2009, The Windup Girl by Polio Bacigalupi. The story is set in a future where global warming has raised sea levels, fossil fuels have been exhausted, and bioterrorism has wiped out the majority of the world's crops. In this world, genetically engineered crops have become the most valuable resource on the planet. The story takes place in Bangkok, Thailand, and the country has largely rejected globalization, and this decision has created enormous political and economic tension. Closing its borders has prevented global corporations from taking control of the country's food supply, but that isolation has also contributed to widespread food insecurity and shortages of just general goods. The novel follows a Western spy, a Chinese refugee, a Thai police officer, and a Japanese pleasure slave as they become caught up in a growing power struggle within the country. The setup brings together characters from different cultures and backgrounds while introducing a wide range of complex issues. What I'm basically saying is there's a lot of cultural and historical baggage to unpack. For example, the white Western spy becomes obsessed with the Japanese slave worker who is being beaten by her Thai owners. So there's a lot going on, and it never really felt like the novel was able to explore the cultural complexities behind these relationships. And part of the reason is that the first half of the book mainly builds up the characters, and then the second part of the novel shifts its focus towards the larger political and economic conflicts affecting Thailand as a whole. Overall, it's an ambitious book that doesn't fully deliver. It felt like some of the more serious issues surrounding victimization were romanticized and flattened. I don't think the author meant to do this, but that's kind of how it came across. So my final thoughts on the books. Darwin's Radio and Camouflage both had, in my opinion, pretty weak endings. Darwin's Radio definitely felt too long, and it didn't really wrap up the story. By the end, I had no desire to read the sequel. Camouflage spends most of the book building toward a confrontation between the two shapeshifters, but that conflict feels a bit anticlimactic since it's resolved in about 5 pages. And then you also get this badly thrown together love story that's included at the end. The Speed of Dark is a decent book, but it just feels like a weaker version of Flowers for Algernon. It is a bit different, but if you're going to have to choose, I would just read Flowers for Algernon. The Windup Girl introduces some really interesting character dynamics, but it doesn't do enough with them. Instead, the novel pivots towards the larger political power struggle within the country. Powers and the Yiddish Policeman's Union, I would say, aren't traditional Nebula winners in the fact that Powers has a magic system, but it doesn't really feel necessary to the story or its medieval setting. It could almost be excluded. The novel is really more of a character study following a slave, and then the Yiddish Policeman's Union is an alternative history where Jewish refugees settle in Alaska. There's no sci-fi or fantasy or anything, it's more speculative fiction. Paladin of Souls approaches fantasy in a more unconventional way, centering on an older female protagonist, and I think it's a solid book that avoids a lot of the tropes you find in most modern fantasy. Seeker and The Quantum Rose feel like they were written for general entertainment. I enjoyed the Lost Colony storyline in Seeker, but there wasn't anything that really stood out to me as exceptional. It was just a solid story. And The Quantum Rose had an interesting setup since it uses quantum scattering theory as an allegory. And to be fair, I think a lot of that went over my head, but the characters and plot were a bit too melodramatic for me, though I definitely wasn't like the demographic for that book. For both of these books, I'm just kind of surprised they won the Nebula. American Gods is a long, meandering book that doesn't follow a traditional narrative structure. It explores 20th century American culture while weaving mythology and magic into the story. I think it holds up, but it is very long, and if you want to read Gaiman, I'd recommend starting with one of his shorter books to see if you like him, because he has a very distinct writing style. So for the books, I would say hold up just in regards to the Nebula Award winners as a whole. It would be American Gods, Paladin of Souls, the Yiddish Policeman's Union, and Powers. Of course, if you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments below. I'm reading through all the Nebula winners, and we'll be making a video for each decade. If you enjoyed the video or want to follow along, please like and subscribe.